something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today we'll be covering a number of current and historical matters related to the deep politics of the U.S. empire. This Devil's Chess Club episode is available to everyone courtesy of Four Died Trying, the new documentary film series which explores the four cataclysmic U.S. political assassinations of the 1960s, the Kennedy brothers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. There's now a Patreon page for Four Died Trying. It offers patrons a number of perks, including a new Four Died Trying podcast and access to the already released films as well as the new chapters as they are released. You can also visit fourdiedtrying.com for details. Devil's Chess Club is an American Exception production. Subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for access to the podcast that explores the deep politics of the U.S. empire. We have over 170 episodes and counting, including an ongoing series featuring Ben Howard and I as we discuss Peter Dale Scott's overlooked work on Far West and the global drug metagroup. This is truly illuminating material, bringing much light to the U.S. empire's clandestine underworld, which has served as imperial dark matter, harnessing a political economy of crime and violence to sow chaos for the neoconservatives' doomed quest for a new American century. Parts 1 and 2 are out already. Part 3 will be released next Tuesday for those who have subscribed to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. I would also like to direct everyone to the GoFundMe campaign for Devil's Chess Club co-host David Talbot. David suffered a massive, nearly fatal stroke while he was in the process of moving out of his family home, which he'd lived in for 30 years, but had to sell because he couldn't afford the taxes and such. Four Died Trying made this nice graphic for us, and we will have John Kirby and Libby Handros on next week to talk about David and his important contributions in terms of moving us toward a more authentic history of this country. So John and Libby will be joined by some other great guests, and this should be a moving tribute for David. At least that's the plan. This is devastating for me and for Bryce and all of David's family and his many friends and admirers. We are having a tribute for him here next week, but for now, I want to tell everyone about the situation and encourage you, if you can, to help David and Camille. They've reached the goal that they set for the fundraiser, but these are guileless people, and they set the goal far below what is likely going to be needed to help them deal with medical care and living expenses going forward now that David cannot write. He presently cannot even speak. This is a very heartbreaking thing for me and for many others who've come to know David and his work. Please help if you can. Vladimir Putin this week released terms for peace negotiations, and he did this right on the eve of these kind of fake peace negotiations that are taking place, led by the West, and which exclude Russia, which are kind of a silly PR exercise. Vladimir Putin issued a statement with some pretty specific plans for conditions for negotiations. He says, "I stress the entire territory of those regions as defined by their administrative borders at the time they joined Ukraine in August of 1991. Our side will order a ceasefire and start negotiations the minute Kiev declares that it is prepared to take this decision and starts actual withdrawal of troops from these regions, and also formally informs us that it no longer plans to join NATO." So again, this is NATO expansion, really the root of this whole thing. As RT reports, at this point, Moscow will not accept a frozen conflict, which would allow the U.S. and its allies to rearm and rebuild the Ukrainian military, Putin claimed. The full resolution of the issue will involve Kiev recognizing the 4 new regions as well as Crimea as part of Russia, he insisted. So this is how the peace plan is likely going to come about when it does. The question is, can the West accept this before the U.S. presidential elections, which would amount to a huge defeat? But based on every military analysis that I take seriously at all, the Ukrainian army is getting destroyed and they're running out of soldiers. Its collapse seems to be inevitable, and anything that the U.S. would do to try to reverse the situation would likely lead to nuclear war in pretty short order. This was the case from the very beginning of the war, really. It's what Obama said about it. He said, we can't have a war there. Russia has escalatory advantage. That explains it in about a sentence. And it's not as if Obama's any kind of peace-loving leftist or anything like that. He just doesn't want to fight stupid wars. He said that himself about Iraq. He said about Iraq, I'm against stupid wars. Okay, he's for other wars, although he did support some stupid wars in Libya and Syria, but and he maintained the stupid war in Afghanistan. Even still, this was too stupid for Barack Obama, but not for a pretty demonstrably senile Joe Biden. Elsewhere, we have the peace talks, or the deal passed by the UN Security Council, or the resolution passed by the Security Council calling for peace or a ceasefire in the Middle East, and it's in Gaza, Israel, Palestine. It remains to be seen whether this is a serious thing that Israel will actually do and that the U.S. is behind. It seems that Hamas has accepted these terms, but is insisting on a permanent ceasefire. And the U.S. and Israeli side are sort of talking out of both sides of their mouths. And the big issue is, can they really agree to a permanent ceasefire? Israel seems hell-bent on wanting to, quote, defeat Gaza, but for every rational observer, this is not really a possible goal unless you destroy the Palestinians in Gaza. We'd have to do a full-on genocidal onslaught, which seems to be what they want to do, although perhaps I will be proven wrong and we will get a peace deal sooner rather than later, which would be a positive thing. I want to talk about a strange story now that appeared in a number of outlets, and this one was on MSN.com, and I believe it was reposted from somewhere else, but I'll summarize it here with a few excerpts from the article. The headline is, U.S.-Saudi Petro-dollar pact ends after 50 years. The 50-year-old petrodollar agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia was just allowed to expire. The term petrodollar refers to the U.S. dollar's role as the currency used for crude oil transactions on the world market. This arrangement has its roots in the 1970s when the U.S. and Saudi Arabia struck a deal shortly after the U.S. went off the gold standard that would go on to have far-reaching consequences for the global economy. In the history of global finance, few agreements have wielded as many benefits as the petrodollar pact did for the U.S. economy. Key takeaway here, the conclusion that they offer, a significant shift in global power dynamics. The expiration of the petrodollar agreement represents a significant shift in global power dynamics. It highlights the growing influence of emerging economies and the changing energy landscape. While the full implications of this shift remain to be seen, investors should at least be aware that on a macro level, the global financial order is entering a new era. The US dollar's dominance is no longer guaranteed. So this article is a bit strange to me, and the other reports on this are as well, because they don't explain much about the petrodollar deal, and they don't really give good sources for what exactly is the basis for them saying that the pact ends after 50 years. They've already been selling oil in other currencies for a while. I believe that it may have been the Chinese that were the first to get this deal, but it was a few years ago that this actually happened. So there are other moves afoot, with Russia separating more from the dollar and de-dollarizing even more, especially in the face of U.S. asset seizures and other chicanery. The U.S. has basically forced other countries to do this, especially Russia. And Russia's a big player in the global economy. So this is what's really bringing the dollar to an end. The U.S. weaponization of the dollar has created its own nemesis, basically. Because once you start to use it that way, then people just look to find other ways to do business. So I'm not sure what the basis of the new report is, or if the people are really very informed at all. It's strange, and it's strange that it got picked up in any bigger outlets at all. But the bigger story of the increasing pace of de-dollarization is definitely very important. And I don't know how much of it you can just pin on this Saudi issue specifically, though. I'll explain more about this in just a moment. But to me, I would also note that it's interesting that you have this article come out that is questionably sourced, or at least ambiguously sourced. It's hard to know how to substantiate this. But it also comes on the heels of the court case involving Saudi Arabia and 9/11, as well as the Atlantic article on the court case going forward, in which the Neocon Atlantic admits that the Saudis had a huge role. The Saudi government officials had a huge role in 9/11, even sponsoring and protecting the hijackers. And the Atlantic makes up a bunch of strange, contrived arguments about how, oh, if only we had known this, if only our intelligence agencies had known this. But you don't have to do much reading to learn that they actually did know about these figures. And in fact, certain CIA officers intervened to make sure the FBI did not become aware of the presence of these people. And the Atlantic article just leaves that out. So I would wonder if this somehow also represents some kind of leak warfare or media warfare, something going on with the US and Saudi Arabia, because these, of course, are very fraught and perilous times. Now, the story of the petrodollar, and I didn't even call it the petrodollar necessarily. I called it the petrodollar US Treasury bill standard. In this article that I wrote published in 2015 online, but I think I wrote most of it in 2014. And it was published in Administration and Society. And I wanted to just read this section because it had it summarized the petrodollar situation and how it's not really just the petrodollar, it's the treasury bill. Because other countries, even if they're not oil producers, they're expected to buy treasury bills. So when the Chinese were purchasing huge amounts of US treasuries, it was because they had big trade deficit and the US would not allow them to buy other assets. And having large amounts of US treasury bills in their reserves kept the Chinese currency from rising too much, and so it helped their exports. So they were in this strange position where the Chinese were funding the US budget deficits by buying so many US treasuries because that was the structure of the global economy, and it still is to an extent. It's very dollar dominated, but that's changing and diminishing day by day. So I'm going to read part of the section on my paper about Bretton Woods because it's a good overview of the situation. Defaulting on Bretton Woods, the petrodollar US Treasury bill standard. Although Middle Eastern oil was of great importance to the United States in the aftermath of World War II, petroleum became even more important after the structural changes to the international economy which occurred during the 1970s. After World War II, the Bretton Woods agreements established a global framework for international currencies. The dollar served as world reserve currency and was valued at 1/35 an ounce of gold. Balance of payments deficits would be settled by the United States with gold. This aspect of the international financial system was generally stable until Vietnam War spending created massive deficits in the U.S. balance of payments. The central banks of European and Asian nations were accumulating vast amounts of dollars. If U.S. leaders had continued to adhere to the gold standard, the U.S. Treasury would have exhausted its gold reserves. To prevent this, the U.S. Senate and President Johnson informally suspended dollar-gold convertibility. President Nixon would formally end the gold standard in 1971, bringing the Bretton Woods era to a close. There's more here, but what I want to add before I go on is that the reason they felt compelled to tie the dollar to gold was not so much for U.S. advantage, except that it would get people to agree to the system. It was really because if they did not have a peg to gold, then the world reserve currency would be controlled by the U.S., and it would be a currency that the U.S. could produce with really no constraints and could therefore buy up the commanding heights of any economy in the world vis-a-vis its control of a fiat global reserve currency untethered to gold or any other real resource. It would give too much power to the United States if it was ever untethered from gold, which, spoiler alert, it becomes untethered from gold. Until 1971, the United States had functioned as the global economic hegemon through its position as the world's largest creditor and through the dollar's status as the world reserve currency. When the gold standard was ended, the rest of the world's nations could have pursued the establishment of a new international monetary order. Rather than following such a course, these nations kept their dollars in lieu of gold. As a result, the United States remained the global capitalist hegemon, but from a position as the world's biggest debtor nation. The dollar and U.S. Treasury bills would play the role previously played by gold. And if the other nations of the world had rejected this arrangement, the result might have been a global systemic shock or economic collapse. So another thing that happens here, which I didn't mention in this article, but which I did put in the book, is that the U.S. at the time that they were orchestrating all of these things in 71 or 72, there were meetings, and probably through 73, meetings about how this new international monetary system could be fixed and reformed to adjust to the new realities that the U.S. couldn't have a gold-backed dollar anymore. And this was essentially a stalling tactic because elsewhere the U.S. was planning for a huge rise in oil prices, which did happen when, in relation to this war in 1973, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the point was they disingenuously entered into negotiations with other countries in the world about this, and then but that was more of a delaying tactic until the oil shock could be essentially orchestrated by the U.S., I argue. The dominance of the dollar has been bolstered by U.S. hegemony over the world's petroleum production. In 1973, shortly after the termination of the gold standard, the world began to experience the now infamous Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries crisis of skyrocketing oil prices. That's OPEC, obviously. There's considerable evidence that the United States was manipulating the shortages. Collusion between the Saudis and Iranians and the Nixon administration has been documented. Decades later, this assessment was confirmed by the Saudi oil minister of the time, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, who revealed, "I am 100% sure that the Americans were behind the increase in the price of oil. The oil companies were in real trouble at that time. They had borrowed a lot of money and they needed a high oil price to save them. It was the U.S. allied Shah of Iran who said to Yamani, 'Why are you against the increase in the price of oil? That is what they want. Ask Henry Kissinger. He is the one who wants a higher price.'" So I would say that his explanation for why this happened is a bit narrow. I don't think it was really the oil companies that were in real trouble. I mean, they may well have been, but the bigger issue was that the entire financial stability of the U.S. imperial system of global capitalism, which it presided over since the end of World War II, was in danger of fracturing. And this really was the crisis, which I believe would have superseded the issue of oil companies' debts. Regardless of the causes of the oil crises of the 1970s, it is clear that although they damaged the global economy, they did redound to the tremendous benefit of the oil majors and the Wall Street banks. In addition, the U.S. Treasury benefited greatly from the rising oil prices and the economic order that emerged during the era. Secret deals were made between the Saudis and two U.S. Treasury secretaries, William Simon and Michael Blumenthal. As per the arrangements, the Saudis would use oil revenues to purchase U.S. Treasury bills in special auctions. In addition, a deal was negotiated in which the Saudis agreed to continue selling oil only in U.S. dollars. These arrangements cemented the status of the dollar as the world reserve currency. As a result, the United States was able to maintain and even aggrandize its exorbitant privilege. Every nation that needed to import oil would have greater incentive to accumulate dollars. At the same time, the United States could essentially print dollars to settle its balance of payments, because the dollar was now, or the treasury bill replaces gold. Okay, if gold is the form that reserves take, that is a difficult thing because there's a finite amount of gold. Treasury bills are basically infinite, especially if they're only entries on a keyboard. But even back when they were actually paper notes, you could still make about as many of them as you needed to. So pulling this trick off, allowing you to replace gold with a currency that you control the creation of, this was an amazing financial coup for the American deep state. The establishment and perpetuation of the post-Bretton Woods petrodollar/U.S. Treasury bill standard represents a significant example and source of hegemonic structural power. The arrangement has been historically novel, especially in the respect that U.S. global primacy has been supported by America's status as the world's largest debtor. However, it is crucial to recognize that U.S. hegemony, like that of all great powers, rests on a basis of overwhelming military primacy. The financial power bequeathed by the hegemonic power structure allows for the financing of a military behemoth with no historical equal. As Chalmers Johnson chronicles, the U.S. empire of bases includes more than 725 international military installations, supported by nearly half a million Americans living around the world. Unlike the great powers of eras past, the United States has been able to pursue this militarization without suffering economic ruin by virtue of the unique aspects of the world order that the United States has established and maintained. So when I say structural power, hegemonic structural power, that means hegemonic means just, in this context, dominance over a particular realm, or imperialistic when you're talking about international relations, more or less, but with a connotation of consent and coercion, not just jackboot imperialism. And the structural power means that you have power as an actor on the world stage such that it allows you to shape the structure of things. So whenever you have social science debates or history debates over structure versus agency, how much can be determined by the actions of certain individuals and actors, and how much is really just the structure of the historical situation that people and countries find themselves in. Well, structural power is the agency to create the structure. That's the power in the highest form, really, when you're talking about politics. Not just power to act within the system, but the power to change the system the way that you want it. And that is what the U.S. was able to do here with this U.S. Treasury bill, petrodollar standard, which I sometimes will call the Rumpelstiltskin dollar. Now, when I wrote my dissertation, which was later published as American Exception Empire and the Deep State, I wrote a little bit about what we see now unfolding. I wrote, perhaps a more likely hopeful scenario would involve other nations escaping the orbit of U.S. imperialism and achieving material prosperity as a result. Russia is saddled with its own rentier oligarchy. A large part of this reality stems from the U.S.-rigged re-election of Boris Yeltsin, as well as U.S.-imposed shock therapy. At any rate, Russia alone is not likely to lead a transition to a multipolar world governed by international law. China, on the other hand, appears to be the real rival to the U.S. The Chinese have experienced massive economic growth within the U.S.-dominated global capitalist system. One key to Chinese success has been the country's refusal to follow the demonstrably disastrous dictates of neoliberalism. In China, the state controls the commanding heights of the economy. In the U.S., and wherever the U.S. holds sway, it is the other way around. Recently, the Chinese leadership has taken steps to raise living standards by cracking down on profiteering in the education, healthcare, and housing sectors. In America, these sectors extract vast sums of wealth from those Americans who choose to get an education, see a doctor, or not be homeless. But unlike China, these parasitic rentier interests in America enjoy a divine right of racketeering. China, we are told, is authoritarian. Having democracy apparently means that the vast majority of the population must submit to being exploited by a tiny privileged elite. But perhaps China is becoming that which the U.S. has tried so hard to preempt or crush anywhere and everywhere, a good economic example that could provide a model and a lifeline for other long-suffering peoples in the global South. Recently, I was on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, and was posting something about one of my latest preoccupations, which deals with the Israeli account, the relationship between U.S. and Israeli intelligence, and then the clandestine deep state battles of Watergate and the post-Watergate era and the Reagan Revolution. And I wrote that I thought that because H.W. Bush had expressed his support for the creation of a Palestinian state and even compelled the Israelis to enter into negotiations for this when he was president by saying that he would withhold loan guarantees. I came to see that Bush was actually, H.W. Bush was really an enemy of the neocons and probably their last real serious opposition in some ways in the U.S. So I looked at some of the things that were happening in that era, and a lot of them in scandals and such, and a lot of them involve CIA operations being scrutinized and exposed in ways that they typically were not in the past. And all of a sudden you have these things that come out. You have the Washington Times writing about things related to the Franklin scandal and a sex ring in the White House. You have the Danny Cosolero octopus story where he is being given information from different people connected to the national security state and this sort of netherworld of, the clandestine realm in the U.S. You had these Gladio documentaries on BBC. You had the October surprise investigation in Congress. You had the continuation of the investigation into Iran-Contra. People like John Walsh, recommending that George Bush potentially be prosecuted for obstruction of justice, especially when he pardons people at the end of his term. I mean, it was strange how much scrutiny George H.W. Bush was facing when typically you did not have U.S. officials having to deal with that kind of thing. So what was really behind this? And one of the items I mentioned, someone questioned me about because I didn't really have much to substantiate it. And I'll get to that soon. But I want to look at an article that I found that really sets the context for a number of the things that we've been talking about lately. And this is a LA Times article. It's called Israeli Intelligence and the CIA, Secret Trouble Among Old Friends. Friends is probably debatable, but we'll get to that. And it's by Thomas Powers, who's a guy who's like a longtime national security writer. So here's what he says. This is January 22nd, 1989, very end of the Ronald Reagan presidency. American recognition of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, last month placed new strain on the troubled intelligence relationship between CIA and Mossad. Reagan's agreement to talk to the PLO was his last important decision before leaving the White House. So think about that when you think about Barack Obama, by the way, coming out and saying after October 7th that he hopes Israel shows some restraint. A lot of these people only feel like they are able to talk candidly about Israel when they leave office or have a foot out the door already, if at all. So this Reagan's decision was a reward for Arafat's much promised, much delayed pledge to concede Israel's right to exist and to renounce terrorism, a promise that the CIA will have to monitor. So this is significant. The PLO concedes Israel's right to exist and it renounces terrorism. That should lead to a Palestinian state, right? Well, wrong, obviously, because we still don't have one. The new strain in the relationship comes from the fact that the CIA's most important ally in terms of tracking Middle East terrorism has been Mossad, Arafat's mortal enemy. CIA's intimate relationship with Mossad will be threatened by the sort of conflict that poisons objective intelligence reporting. Unlike Bush, hardline Israeli Prime Minister Shamir refuses to concede the PLO is out of the terrorism business, which suggests that Israel and U.S. intelligence officers will soon be arguing about the correct interpretation of facts gathered in the field. When politics colors intelligence, two things happen. Inconvenient facts are ignored, and convenient, quote, facts are sometimes created. Terrorism is sometimes created. Is this where we're going? Or facts about it? Was very interesting. Very interesting to think of what he means by convenient facts are sometimes created. National leaders, not just public, can find it hard to tell one from the other. The CIA's working relationship with Israeli intelligence is one of its oldest and closest, rivaled only by its ties to the Brits. For decades, the Israeli account was part of the fiefdom of James Angleton, head of CIA counterintelligence, and whose fixation with the KGB's clandestine abilities bordered on paranoia. That's one way to say it. It's been said that Angleton got the job as a result of his close working relationship he had developed just after World War II with Jews in Italy who were organizing secret transportation across the Mediterranean. They were helping survivors of Hitler's Holocaust trying to reach what was then British-controlled Palestine. This is interesting because it's something that comes up in the church committee testimony, which was classified for decades, for many decades, until just about a year ago or so, or a year and a half ago, which I've commented on previous episodes. So I don't know everything that was written about James Angleton, but you do wonder where he got this information, if it was somebody who was privy to that testimony or some other source. If this had been reported in more sources, that's quite possible. Angleton formed other ties with the new state of Israel after its founding, including a friendship with the mayor of Jerusalem. And in 1951, he asked the CIA director to establish a formal liaison with the new Israeli intelligence service. And for years, Angleton ran this from his hip pocket. They had much to offer each other. The Americans spent a whole lot of money on global intelligence gathering, and they had great technical expertise. And the Israelis had an unparalleled network of agents in the Middle East and also even throughout the Soviet Union. They were one of the best ways to be able to communicate with the large and increasingly restive Jewish population in the USSR. Over time, Angleton developed a reputation for sympathy with Israel of the sort sometimes described in diplomatic and intelligence circles as going native. He shared the Israeli conviction that the PLO was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Soviet Union under direct KGB control, a claim evidently rejected by CIA analysts. When Colby took over the CIA in 1973, Angleton lost the Israeli account, and 2 years later, December 75, he was forced to retire following bitter disagreement over the way he ran his principal fiefdom, counterintelligence. Okay, what this article doesn't say is that the field of counterintelligence basically gave Angleton control of all of the most serious, sensitive secrets of the U.S. national security state, of the intelligence agencies especially. And this included apparently even the ability to murder U.S. officials like Frank Olson, who were deemed security risks. So this was a very, very sensitive position. And as they say here, Angleton was thought to have gone native, meaning to have become very sympathetic to Israel. Jeff Morley has said essentially that he was like an Israeli agent and quoted other people to that effect. So this is quite a thing to think about as a person who had an extreme amount of sympathy for Israel and who ideologically approved of their commitment to opposing any sort of détente with groups that were opposed to the West, like the PLO or the Soviet Union. In the 2 decades that he was in charge of liaison with the Israelis, the Mossad won a reputation as perhaps the best intelligence service. Superbly efficient, imaginative, aggressive, and with full political support at home, which I think is key. They will not be scrutinized by their own population. This means they could be trusted to keep the secrets. One result was a growing readiness among Washington officials to let, and sometimes to ask, the Israelis to do things Washington dared not do for fear of congressional opposition. The Iran-Contra affair was one example of this intermingling of U.S. and Israeli actions. And we don't even know the extent of this. Angleton was involved in some of these early relationships with the mob, the Lansky Syndicate. And the Lansky Syndicate has as yet not completely defined relationship to Israel and Mossad. And this seems to have been brought to bear with the Cuban business, the assassination projects. They involved some Israeli account assets. And this is something that's sort of fraught with implications and possibilities the more you look at this. Recent news stories suggest bilateral cooperation went even further. In 1985, Reagan approved, reportedly, a new terms of reference for U.S.-Israeli pact on intelligence exchanges that included proposals for a jointly run counterterrorism program. And at about the same time, Reagan allegedly approved intelligence findings authorizing aggressive counterterrorism operations, including assassination, overriding his own executive order prohibiting assassination. Israel has denied that there's any such agreement, and U.S. officials have not commented. When we left off, we were talking about the 1989 LA Times article that was about the relationship between the U.S. and Israeli intelligence agencies, and also tying this into the bigger issue of the U.S. relationship to Israel and the way that the U.S. under Ronald Reagan at the very end of his term, well, which was when this article was written, had reconciled with the PLO and said that they had denounced terrorism and renounced terrorism, and that they could begin negotiations. This, to my mind, is very significant now in retrospect, and it isn't remarked on that much. But my understanding is that Ronald Reagan, at the end of his term, or towards the end of his term, he became disenchanted with the neoconservatives, and he put other more corporate liberal types like George Shultz in more powerful positions, and he somewhat sidelined the neocons. And this is significant. It was a neocon, Richard Pearl, who at Reykjavik essentially told Reagan that it was unacceptable for him to sign a treaty with the Russians, the Soviets, that would have eventually led to the abolition of nuclear weapons. So this is something very serious in retrospect. Now, Reagan is a person that I would have generally associated more with the neocons, but I think that he may have actually been moving more towards the corporate internationalist perspective of H.W. Bush, perhaps towards the end of his presidency. And so this is significant. Now, this is also something important here, what they're talking about in the article. Recent news stories suggest the bilateral cooperation went further. In 1985, Reagan approved new terms of reference for U.S.-Israel counterterrorism, that they would be doing these things jointly. Reagan allegedly approved intelligence findings that offered that allowed them to do more aggressive counterterrorism, including assassinations, which was something that would override his own executive order very early in his term that prohibited assassination, because this was a big scandal in the 70s with the Rockefeller Commission and Gerald Ford sort of blurting out that like this stuff could lead to discoveries about assassination, and which it did to some extent, that the U.S. admitted having attempted to assassinate foreign nationals, but they really dissembled and obscured the extent to which they really did, including on a number of cases like Lumumba and Allende, Schneider, Rafael Trujillo, even the one guy you can't really feel that sorry about getting assassinated, as he used to feed his enemies to sharks. But still, it was a U.S. assassination, apparently. I don't think that Kennedy actually approved that. I think the CIA was doing its own thing, I would guess. But you can't ever disprove those things. But anyway, Israel has denied the existence of any such agreement, while U.S. officials have withheld comment. So pregnant with implication is this fact that in the mid-'80s under Reagan, the intelligence agencies of these two countries apparently decided that they would cooperate on counterterrorism together, because I don't think that we can call Israel an impartial arbiter of what constitutes terrorism and just what the uses and problems are with terrorism and so on. It's just, Israel is a country that was born through acts of terrorism and attacks on people in the Palestinian Mandate, and has benefited from terrorism in the region in that it allowed sort of a pretext for the military hegemon of the world, the U.S., to invade and attack Israel's enemies. 9/11 most famously, but then these terrorists also get used in Syria, Libya, etc. Okay, this long history between the CIA and Mossad of trust and cooperation has been shadowed by an element of doubt on the U.S. side that borders on anti-Semitism. That's a term that should raise suspicions these days, the way that we now understand how this is used to basically shield Zionism from any criticism. From its beginning, the agency was reluctant to give American Jews responsibility for intelligence on the Middle East in general and on Israel in particular. Some years ago, I was told that no Jew had ever served as Israeli desk officer in the Directorate of Intelligence, the analytical side of the agency, and no Jew had ever been responsible for Middle Eastern estimates on the Board of Estimates, which produced annual reports on various areas of the world. Whether this is still the case, I do not know, but it is not hard to find CIA intelligence officers who believe that the agency has sometimes served Israeli interests at the expense of its own, that Israel has hard to explain access to U.S. intelligence secrets, and that domestic U.S. political pressures have prevented the FBI and CIA's own counterintelligence officers from monitoring Israeli intelligence efforts in the United States. So these policies, if true, I guess you could quibble about some of these, about who would be serving as the Israeli desk officer and the director of intelligence. That said, Israel makes much of itself as the embodiment of Judaism and the sort of manifestation of the Jewish people or something. It's a strange, basically fascist formulation of like the people, the Volk or something. It's that they put out there all the time. So it's this is a complicated thing here. I think that it's wrong when they do that. I don't think that you can equate Judaism with the actions of the Zionist state entity, whatever we want to call it. I think that's actually an anti-Semitic proposition. And yet the biggest purveyors of that are Zionists themselves in terms of just equating Zionism with Judaism. So it's strange that the biggest purveyors of this are also the ones who will call it out if that sort of thinking is deployed in other circumstances. Intelligence services have their own priorities and find ways to cooperate even if the governments disagree. The CIA used to protect. They hired and protected former Nazis. They now maintain a close relationship with South Africa, despite it being an apartheid state at the time that this was written. And it has shared intelligence with the Chinese and even with the Soviets. So this is something that they're pointing out, that, oh, this is just a normal thing for intelligence agencies to work together, even if they don't always agree philosophically. Intelligence agencies are amoral. What they could have added is that the Israelis themselves also worked with Nazis, like Hitler's favorite terrorist, Otto Skorzeny. There was a person that was an assassin, a terrorist, and so on, and the Israelis basically told him that they could kill him if they wanted to because he had been a Nazi, but they would like to just work with him, and it would be good if he could kill this German scientist who was working for NASA developing missiles. So intelligence agencies are totally amoral by and large, and the Israelis are no exception. They do have a very aggressive, let's say, vision and national project, more than perhaps any country in the world when it comes down to it, such that they wouldn't mind working with Nazis even. That to me is a remarkable thing if you want to understand how really amorality is the order of the day. So this whole context here that I was talking about, I wanted to bring up in relation to this book by Peter Brewton, The Mafia, the CIA, and George Bush. And recently on Twitter, I was writing about my thesis that I've come up with recently, that a lot of the things that were happening in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, that we would look at as being deep political events and mysteries of the deep political system, that these were related to a kind of mafia intelligence war between what you could call neoliberal and neoconservative factions of the U.S. oligarchy and political class. I believe that the neoconservative side increasingly can be traced to the issue of Israel, and especially Greater Israel, that this obsession with Greater Israel and making sure that there could never be a Palestinian state has been the guiding, the lodestar of neoconservatism. There are other elements within this coalition in the United States that make it difficult to disentangle what is really driving it. And I'm open to other arguments about this because I don't think that this is something that can be easily proven definitively. But I believe that if you look at the behavior of some of these officials, and then you look at the stories of intelligence scandals that came out around this time, what happened in the 70s and 80s and 90s was that these pro-neocon side, these pro-neoconservative people who are very pro-Israel wanted to weaken or somehow seize through a kind of covert clandestine warfare, political warfare. They wanted to seize control of what you could call the deep state. And in this case, I don't mean the deep state as in the regime or the overall set of institutions that allow for top-down rule in a nominal democracy. I mean the other usage of the term deep state, which is the most sensitive clandestine aspects of the regime, the most sensitive institutions and operations and arrangements that exist. Basically, what is sovereignty in the Schmittian sense, like those entities that most clearly control the exception and the access to the most sensitive secrets. And I believe that when Angleton was running the Israeli account, you essentially had a kind of neoconservative deep state before people even used the term neoconservative. And it brought together anti-détente people and hardline Zionists. I believe that was part of what happens with Watergate, is that Nixon was doing things to threaten this arrangement, especially he fires Richard Helms. And if you recall, James Angleton's man, James McCord, was in jail, and he was writing that if Nixon fires Helms, it's going to be a scorched desert and every tree in the forest will fall. Why would that have been the case? Because it was Helms who, as the kind of successor to Allen Dulles in a sense, like the sort of grand man at the CIA who eventually becomes the director of the CIA. He had previously only been the director of operations when John McCone was there and the rest of Kennedy's tenure, but eventually he becomes the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And I believe that Angleton was kind of in his control, although I don't know that he necessarily was privy to what was going on with Watergate, because as Peter Dale Scott's pointed out, Richard Helms seemed a little bit shocked by Watergate initially and did try to scramble to cover some things up, which to me suggests that he was not privy to everything that Angleton was doing. But Angleton, for whatever reason, felt he had license to do that. And it is notable that when Richard Nixon gets reelected, with people like James McCord in jail, Richard Nixon does not, he does fire Richard Helms, and then everything gets worse and worse for him. And during this time, they also went after Meyer Lansky, and he fled to Israel. And that's relevant. The syndicate and the connection of the syndicate, Hoffa, Lansky, all this whole underworld was likely protected by Angleton as much as anyone. But then, of course, Hoover on the FBI side was very tight with the Mafia as well, and organized crime and powerful oligarchic forces connected there. So this is how you were able to have this kind of deep political system in the United States, and the deep state part of it, which I would say was centered in Angleton's office, was a huge component of it. And when they go after Meyer Lansky and they end up shutting down the Air America gets exposed, the drug trafficking in Southeast Asia, and they even have Alfred McCoy write a limited hangout of sorts about this, but that does expose it and creates a need to change some of these institutions up. They shut down Castle Bank. Okay, that was, I think, a more of a syndicate operation. I mean, it was established by Paul Helliwell, who was an associate of Meyer Lansky. He was basically Meyer Lansky's lawyer, and is a very shady character in all of this. So it seems that the old boys of the CIA, people like in the George Bush milieu, Shackley, Bush, these kinds of people, they wanted to create. They wanted to shut these things down, or at least Nixon did. But once they start to get shut down, these people try to create new institutions to kind of fill in where the CIA had been kind of incapacitated by congressional investigations and the shutting down of some of these deep political arrangements. So this is what I think related to Watergate. That is basically James Angleton, who was likely the person who put the burglars together. And three of them had connections to the Kennedy assassination, which I think made it so explosive that they couldn't really investigate it. It almost guaranteed that Nixon would be pressured to resign, because the Kennedy assassination involves, I think, the whole U.S. establishment, or at least the pinnacle of it. I think that it's likely an old boy CIA job, but it was outsourced to Angleton, or assigned to Angleton, probably outside the agency or via Helms, but I think probably outside the agency. I would guess somebody like Alan Dulles would speak to Angleton, because he would be aware of Angleton's little fiefdom, because he'd probably helped him construct it to a large degree. So I think that the neocon forces that are very pro-Zionist have been looking to expose some of the chicanery of this group, in the hopes that they can recreate something, that they could recreate something like the Israeli account under Angleton, that a lot of things would be outsourced, a lot of the most sensitive and shady things like sexual blackmail, alliances with drug traffickers, assassination projects, and so on, that Israel could handle these things, or some kind of neoconservative outfit could do this. The Neocon Syndicate International, I call it sometimes. And as I look at the early 90s and this period where it looks like Reagan is kind of wavering on, where he is wavering, the last act is to recognize the PLO in a certain capacity. And then George H.W. Bush comes in and he forces Israel to enter into negotiations for a Palestinian state. I believe that these guys are sensible realists in a sense. I mean, they're imperialists, and Mearsheimer would call them, liberals or whatever. But to me, they're just the realists in the room. They're kind of the adults in the room who are realists and are more pro-USA, pro-dollar empire for the world, pro-corporate America. And they thought that these neoconservatives were dangerous because they were going to risk, turning the U.S. into a pariah. Like when Ronald Reagan in 1983 pulls the Marines out of Lebanon because he doesn't want the U.S. to be, or he orders the Israelis to stop some of these bombings because he doesn't want the U.S. to be embroiled in disastrous wars, and he doesn't want the U.S. its image to be destroyed because of the brutality of Israel and all of these, murdered and maimed children appearing on the nightly news. And H.W. Bush likely foresaw that the neoconservatives were a risk to the U.S. empire. So it's not that Bush or Reagan are good guys at all. I would never accuse them of being good people with good political views. They are just sensible imperialists. And the neocons are either crazy, unhinged imperialists, or they are realists in the sense that the state that they are so devoted to protecting and protecting existentially above all is not just Israel, but greater Israel. And if you think of it that way, then the neocons are actually realists in a sense, but they are the ultimate crackpot realists, because I think that greater Israel is a crackpot scheme that cannot be accomplished in this day and age, because it necessarily entails genocide, and you just could not do that. If Reagan and Bush were thinking that they couldn't, it's not that Reagan and Bush cared that much about the Palestinian people, I wouldn't say, but they understood that this was a terrible look for them. All this, the same reasons that Eisenhower intervened on the side of Nasser in 1956. So what does this have to do with this book and other episodes at the time? I mean, BCCI is another example at this time. The investigation into this that Peter Dell Scott was a part of was supervised by a person working under Senator John Kerry, and that person was a guy named Jack Blum, and Peter discovered that he was an Israeli asset. So that tracks with what I've been saying here too. And I've sussed some of these things out by asking Peter about these different episodes, because he's the one person who's really looked at them in detail. This is a very understudied area for academics to look into because of the avoidance of deep politics, parapolitics, the clandestine state, all of these issues that academics don't like to deal with. So I had asked Peter about these things. Now, as far as this book is concerned, there was someone on Twitter I was writing on Twitter about all these things, and I was listing some of them, and I said all these strange things that are happening that seem to fit this pattern of a of an attack on the old boy network. And then you look at them, and some of them trace to the neocons or to pro-Israel forces specifically. And I thought about the octopus, these people that were feeding this information to Danny Cosolaro, and it involved like Shackley and Bush and this whole thing that they were trying to put together. And the octopus could be one name for it, or you could call it the Enterprise. But they're being attacked in a sense by somebody, whoever is feeding all of this to Cosolaro, and he was writing articles and so on. But then he really wanted to put it into a book, so it didn't end up working this way. But it creates a fascinating story about this person who tried to uncover this conspiracy. I don't think he ever articulated it very well or understood what he was looking at. I don't really think anybody else has understood what Cosolaro was looking at. I think that I'm correct about this, though, that it really was a George H.W. Bush old boy CIA network of the sort of waspy Eastern establishment wanting to recreate the clandestine system that existed, in the earlier days of the CIA, but without the Israeli influence that was exercised through Angleton. And if you thinking of this as a possibility, it actually tracks with a lot of other things. So one of the episodes that I cited as evidence that these strange things were going on at the end of the Cold War, including, by the way, this is similar to Oliver Stone and him having as the executive producer Arnon Milchan, who was an Israeli agent and somebody who I believe had been instrumental in helping Israel get the bomb even. And I think that JFK is a masterpiece. It's probably my favorite political movie, and it may be kind of it may be my favorite political movie by a wide margin. This book, The Mafia, the CIA, and George Bush, is a very useful book. I don't mean to say that Pete Brewton is like intentionally acting as an asset of Israel. But there's this question of who's feeding him, who's giving him information about a lot of these things, and how is he able to even stay on as a newspaper reporter when he's going after people this powerful, and how does he manage to get published? So in my mind, this aspect of the political history of the time points to a neocon and likely pro-Zionist hand. Now, somebody online asked, for good reason, because I really wasn't providing much evidence for this, so it wasn't a acrimonious exchange, really. I mean, Twitter, everything, if you disagree with someone a little, it can seem like it's fighting words, but it really wasn't at all. The guy's a totally nice person in my experience, and sincere person. But he questioned this. I think it's a he. It's hard to know on Twitter, obviously. But he or she argued that this was a good book, and Brewton's talked about the writing of his book, and he did a lot to expose, a bunch of corruption and crime and so on, and among people in high places, which I would agree with. But I said, I said, to me, it's published in 1992. It just fits the template too perfectly. I would guess that there's some chicanery there. Like, how is he getting this institutional support? But I really wasn't aware of it, and I don't normally talk about things or cite things in this way that I'm not pretty sure of with some sort of empirical evidence to back me up, because I am an academic and I try to be careful with things. But this just fit the template so perfectly that I thought it's got to be. I felt that it was. But then when he actually said, like, well, why are you saying this? I thought, well, maybe I will actually bother to look it up. Maybe I'll do a little bit of digging. So that's what I did. And it was fascinating to me what I was able to find. So this is one of the books written by Sapolsky Publishers, or Sapolsky Publishing. And the book by Brewton is on SPI, the label SPI, but it's an imprint of Sapolsky, so it's Sapolsky Publishers. And I went to find out what their catalog was like, and you have a lot of books on Israel and Israel-related subjects, or Jewish studies in the U.S., but often with a quite pro-Israel bent, as you can find. You can look this up yourself if you'd like. But here's one. It's a memoir of an Israeli war hero, it says. And also interesting is among the books that they published is the Robert F. Kennedy Assassination, New Revelations on the Conspiracy and Cover-Up. This is by Philip H. Melanson, who was an academic. I believe he was at UMass, I think. I have one of his books, or two of his books. I have another shorter book he did on Robert Kennedy. I don't have this one. And I also have his book, Spy Tales or something. I have the book. I'm looking at my bookshelf. Spy Saga. It's about Lee Harvey Oswald, and it's still pretty useful book today if you want to look at what was going on with Oswald. But this gets back to my point. It was like even this far back, they are people are using the Kennedy assassination, like apparent agents of Israel or publishing house that publishes a lot of this kind of stuff, publishing things on the Kennedy assassination. Like, this is kind of that old boy thing. And they have some other books on the JFK assassination too. But Melanson's a good writer. I mean, he's a solid writer. It's fascinating. This is where you'd have to go to get published. Another book which comes up in some of my digging into, and this took almost no time, by the way, to find some of the basics of these facts, which I hope to lay out in a coherent manner in this episode. But another book that I looked at was A Mandate for Terror, the United Nations and the PLO, which was related to that subject of the article that I was reading earlier, the Powers article. And this is a book by a guy named Harris O. Schoenberg, and it's basically arguing that the PLO did not renounce terror. Okay, and the UN is wrong to be saying that they did. Now, the significance here is that this is just what I've been arguing, that the obsession is with Greater Israel. And the problem for them and the PLO is that Israel needs to say that the Palestinians are terrorists because it's sort of taken as a truism that, you can't negotiate with terrorism and terrorists are so bad. So for the PLO to renounce terror would be bad for Israel. And it was bad for the Israeli hardliners, because if you have a partner that's interested in recognizing Israel, is open to recognizing Israel, and is renouncing terrorism, then you have a avenue for an end to the Palestinian conflict that would end with a Palestinian state. And that seems to be their obsession. These hardline Zionists, the people that we come to be known as neoconservatives, seems to be an obsession with not allowing the creation of a Palestinian state and with going for Greater Israel, either apartheid until you can finally have some kind of final solution. This fits that pattern, in my estimation. And by the way, this is why I would argue, and other people would as well, that the Israelis boosted Hamas. I mean, we already know that they supported Hamas and helped to bring it from obscurity because they wanted something to eclipse the PLO. That the PLO, with its secular philosophy and ideology and its call for a Palestinian state, that they were more, and its renouncing of terrorism, that this was a threat to Greater Israel. And so you boost up Hamas, because now you can't say that Hamas was engaging in acts of terrorism, and they were an unsympathetic party as far as Israel and the Western world was concerned. And so that's why they would boost an entity like Hamas. That's why Bibi Netanyahu brags about having kept Hamas alive functioning for a while, because this is what's stopping a Palestinian state. They're often quite candid about it. It's a bit shocking, and I understood that they weren't wanting a Palestinian state. I don't think it was until October 7 that I understood the significance of this in U.S. foreign policy and the deep political history that I have written about. Although, to be fair, I do stop my book at the election of Ronald Reagan, and so I didn't attempt to write about this very much at all. I didn't write very much about Israel, but everything I say about Israel is kind of, if you look at it, and there's only a few times I mention it in the book, but it's all pregnant with implication, and none of it is, this doesn't contradict anything that I wrote. It just adds on things that I left as kind of question marks or statements that could be a lot more fleshed out if you go back and look. Okay, so Schoenberg is the person who wrote that book about the PLO and the UN, and he eventually is unhappy with his publishing contract, which is a not uncommon thing. As you'll find, Brewton himself was eventually really pissed off at this outfit and tried to take him to court. They were pretty shady all around, but you'll get a sense of that. So this was from 1996, but it goes back quite a while. A conflict between the plaintiff Schoenberg, who was the author of a book entitled A Mandate for Terror, and the defendants who were involved in a disputed contract to publish the book. The contract, the disputed one, was signed by the plaintiff Schoenberg and the defendant Steinmatzky Publishing of North America in 1985. In 87, before the book was published, the defendant Sapolsky Publishing Incorporated had assumed all assets and liabilities of Steinmatzky Publishing. Okay, and this part is key here, I guess. Ian Sapolsky was the sole owner of Steinmatzky Publishing and was the president and sole stockholder of SPI. The plaintiff, in an effort to remain in this forum, seeks to amend and assert a claim of fraud in the inducement. The proposed claim is that Steinmatzky Publishers falsely represented that it was an authorized representative of Steinmatzky Ltd., a highly regarded publisher in the field of Judaica, and thereby falsely induced plaintiff to enter into the disputed agreement. So this guy's beef with them was that they were misrepresenting themselves as being something that they weren't. Steinmatzky is this outfit in Israel that I believe is like the biggest independent bookseller, or it's like the famous bookstore and bookseller in Israel. So the Steinmatzky Publishing, which eventually becomes Sapolsky Books, and Ian Sapolsky, they have a number of books like this that are, they seem harmless enough. They seem fine. Different books on things related to Jewish culture and also related to Israel as well. I mean, it seems to be very much of the mindset that like Israel is kind of inextricable from Jewish identity is what my sense of looking at the book titles, but I'd have to read them all to say that, with any kind of certainty. But this is what they were writing. I mean, so this to me was interesting as I found this out anyway, because I was thinking, my main thought was thinking this seems to be kind of pro-Israel business to put out this book on Brewton by Brewton on George Bush and the mob and the CIA and the SNL scandal. And what do I find but that it was a very pro-Israel outfit that published this. So that to me was interesting in and of itself. And even if that was all that I'd found, I'd be like, well, that's interesting and weird. Now you go to Steinmatzky, and I'm not trying, Steinmatzky is the actual Israeli outfit that Sapolsky was sort of seemingly trying to impersonate with his Steinmatzky Publishing of North America. But you can go to the Steinmatzky site today and you can look at their reading list, and they do have a decidedly Zionist flavor, as you can tell by this small selection. Holocaust lexicon, which, okay, that could just be about the Holocaust, but Herzl Anuri. The last book is entitled It is the State of Israel, and that's not a very cryptic title. That would seem to be a book that would presumably include advocacy for Zionism. Now, if you look into the Schoenberg versus Sapolsky publishers, you will find something pretty interesting. This is more related to that lawsuit, okay? After attorney repeatedly failed to respond to opposing counsel's request for basically a discovery motion, he was found in contempt of court, and they imposed some sanctions, which are not really that interesting to me. But the key here that is interesting is who is representing Sapolsky. And here it's a guy named Samuel A. Abadi. And this is, to me, interesting because he seems to be involved in some other relevant activities. Appeals court upholds terrorist label for a Jewish group. This is from 2006. A militant Jewish group and two of its affiliates were properly designated as terrorist organizations by the State Department. A federal appeals court here ruled Tuesday. The group Kahain Chai is a spin-off of the radical Kach movement of Rabbi Mir Kahane, or Meyer Kahane, Mir Kahane. I don't know if it's Meyer or Mir, I can't remember. But I do know of his murder because famously he was killed in 1990. And although Ali Mohammed and the Blind Sheikh were involved in this, they seem to have been protected U.S. assets of some kind. And so they basically pinned it on a lone nut. And this group, Kahane Chai, which means Kahane lives, so Meyer Kahane, you can't kill him, advocates the restoration of the biblical state of Israel and the expulsion of Arabs from Israel. So it's getting right into what I was saying. This issue of Greater Israel seems to be quite salient to some people, if we didn't know that. Okay, Mr. Powell found that the group had threatened to carry out assassinations. I'm guessing this is Colin Powell, notably of Ariel Sharon when he was Prime Minister of Israel, used explosives or firearms to endanger people and property, and solicited money and members for terrorist organizations. In a 2003 letter to the State Department, a lawyer for Kahane Chai, Samuel Abedi, said it and its affiliates were, quote, legitimate Jewish activist organizations, none of which practices, supports, or advocates terrorism. The group's current lawyer, Kenneth Klein, did not respond to telephone and email messages. So this is Samuel Abedi, presumably the same person. It's possible that it's a different Samuel Abedi, and if so, then okay, then we can just say that this other material is interesting and suggests a pro-Israel / Neocon connection. But I would guess that this is the same Samuel Abedi. Now, say he comes up again, this character, and this article is at the Daily News, and it's got a weird formatting issue, and it says it was updated in April 9, 2018, but I don't know what they did to it, and it might be interesting to go back and find the original. But here's the article. A lawyer has a secret job as terror foe, and it says, it seemed like a run-of-the-mill drug case, but when lawyer Samuel Abedi requested more time to file court papers, it wasn't for run-of-the-mill reasons. Abedi stunned a federal judge in February when he said he had a pressing national security business connected to the war on terrorism, according to court papers unearthed last week. If Manhattan federal court judge Loretta Preska was dubious about Abedi's explanation, she only needed to look at an attached supporting affidavit, an impressive declaration from a top Pentagon official that seemed to only deepen the mystery. Mr. Abedi is currently involved in a highly sensitive matter which is vital to U.S. national security and potentially affects the lives of our military personnel in the Middle East, said Michael Maloof, Bush administration point man on linking Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. Was he talking about the same Sam Abedi who was representing an alleged cocaine dealer from the Bronx? I'm not free to discuss the nature of his work, Maloof added. I can say generically it involves matters which bear directly on U.S. national security interests, and in particular the worldwide war on terrorism. Okay, well, that is fascinating. The matter had already required Abedi to travel to the Middle East and to Europe. Would the judge please grant the lawyer's request for a continuance? An attorney for more than 2 decades, Abedi, who is Lebanese, is a low-profile but respected member of the bar whose work involves criminal and civil cases. This part, I think, is the fascinating one. His diplomatic career apparently got rolling last year when he turned up as a lawyer for Richard Pearl, a member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Advisory Board, who is widely regarded as the chief architect of the Bush administration's Iraq policy. Pearl came to Abedi for help when he was accused by members of Congress of mixing personal business interests with his defense job. Maloof said it was through Pearl that he met Abedi. Asked last week about his secretive second career, Abedi said, I have absolutely no comment. So this to me is fascinating because, of course, Pearl is the kind of godfather of the hard-right neocons. And of course, very pro-Israel. He was a person who, as I said earlier, wrote or essentially advised or strongly told Ronald Reagan that he couldn't really sign a deal with Russia to get rid of nuclear weapons because that would be unacceptable for whatever reason, known only to Pearl. He also is one of the people who was involved in writing the clean break report for Bibi Netanyahu in the mid-90s, which called for, it was basically like Project for a New American Century version of, policy in the Middle East, except it was written for the Israeli prime minister, and it dealt with what the Israelis wanted. It advocated also for the Iraq War harshly, strongly. So then it included people like people that were in the W. Bush administration, like Wolfowitz and Pearl, and it was commissioned by Bibi Netanyahu. So the fact that this person would be connected to Richard Pearl, of all people, and doing this kind of work, and also how strange is it that somebody as powerful as Richard Pearl, when he ran into trouble, when he ran into trouble with Congress of mixing personal business interests with his defense job, this is the person that he turns to for help, is Abedi, this guy who's also representing drug dealers. It says here he's Lebanese and is a low-profile but respected member of the bar. So, whose work involves criminal and civil cases. Why would he be representing somebody like Pearl? Why would Pearl be sending him on national security assignments? This is just truly bizarre. But what it does to me suggest is that these networks in which Abedi was a part of were responsible for the Brewton book ever seeing the light of day, or seeing the light of day in 1992, when George H.W. Bush is up for re-election. None of this is to say that Pete Brewton's book is a bad book in any way. I think it was a good book, and it's a useful book. I've cited it in my dissertation, and I bought a copy of it many years ago, and you can find some interviews with the guy, and they're pretty interesting. It looks almost as if I'm correct about this, and there was a kind of Neocon international takeover of the clandestine realm, perhaps of the deep state in a sense, that the SNL scandal was kind of a template that other actors used for the subprime collapse, the crisis there. It seemed to be, there seemed to have been a lot of looting going on there and control fraud, as Bill Black has written about. And some people have suggested that Epstein himself played a role in this through his job at Bear Stearns, maybe, or his role at Bear Stearns. And I'm not expert in that, so you could go look into that elsewhere. But to me, that is fascinating, because Epstein seems to have taken over the sexual blackmail roles or jobs that were previously done by more U.S. connected actors, perhaps. But perhaps you just outsource this, as Powers was pointing out in his article. Like, the U.S. can just outsource some shady business to foreign intelligence agencies, and has done this especially with Israel in the past. So that may be a part of that whole story. But regardless, some of the things in this era, I believe the exposés of BCCI were really useful in a sense, and that Oliver Stone's JFK is a fantastic movie, and Pete Brewton's book is a good book. Cosolaro unearthed some weird and interesting things in his investigation, but these things are strange when you look at them, because they seem to be being propelled by pro-Zionist forces, and these are forces which came to have more power in the government. And I believe that if you look at our other series on American Exception on the Global Drug Meta Group and Far West, it's like Far West basically takes over some of the things that BCCI was doing, but it seems to be more connected to a supranational entity or a multinational group, or perhaps to a group that's just centered that's anchored within Mossad, but tied to organized crime. That's how it appears if you look at the Global Drug Meta Group and you look at Far West. So I think this is significant if you look today at what has happened, because the realists like Bush and Brzezinski and Kissinger, Brzezinski basically warned you don't want to do anything that will bring Russia and China and Iran together, united by just basically grievances against the West. You want to somehow be able to manage politics in a way that you don't generate opposition to end U.S. hegemony. And he was a realist, and he's more American realist in the Rockefeller vein. And George H.W. Bush himself wanted a Palestinian state, and he was even arguing against nationalism in the former Soviet Union and the breakup of the Soviet Union, which is also a fascinating thing to consider. So what in the world can we make of this today? Well, I think that the people like Bush and Brzezinski and Kissinger, They are cold realists. They don't mind fighting wars or conflicts or having economic policies that'll kill, vast numbers of people. They aren't good guys in any way, shape, or form, but they were interested in keeping their empire and keeping U.S. hegemony and maintaining the status of the dollar and maintaining the U.S. status as the top superpower in the world. And they didn't want to pursue reckless policies. They believe that George H.W. Bush called the neocons the crazies. So he was for Greater Israel, and he wasn't for bringing about the end of the Soviet Union and for nationalism in places like Ukraine. But the neocons won this power struggle. And I think part of the way they won the power struggle was through political warfare. And I bet we only know the half of it. And so we now are in a position where people who are realists in the U.S. sense, even imperialist realists, of the old Bush, Brzezinski, Rockefeller sort of mindset, Kissinger and all that, these people are not, they have not been able to restrain the neocons. The neocons wanted the U.S. to be the unipolar power and for no other challenger to rise. That's what Wolfowitz argued. And then H.W. Bush basically had somebody leak that to the press, apparently, to warn them about what the crazy neocons were up to. But then these crazy people like Wolfowitz go on to write the Clean Break Report for Israel a few years later. And then after that, you have the Project for a New American Century right before 9/11, which is saying that the U.S. needs to dominate the world forever and then have full spectrum dominance in every area: satellite warfare, space warfare, biological warfare, information. It's the most insane manifesto for global dominance, open-ended, just forever, global dominance forever. And but they say it's going to be hard to do that if you don't have a Pearl Harbor, and then you end up getting a Pearl Harbor on September 11th, 2001. And we fight these 9/11 wars. Then they get paused for a moment, but Obama resumes the regime change operations with Syria and Libya, which were neocon dreams for a while, and that were not really beneficial to the U.S., but they were suitable for the goals of the ultra-right neocons who want a greater Israel, and they need the U.S. to be the unchallenged military power in order to make this happen, because otherwise the rest of the world is not going to support this endeavor. And so it's existential for them in their calculations, if I am correct about that. I don't know how much input comes from, or how much of the propelling force comes from very pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli people, and how much comes from Americans who are more interested in making money in the military-industrial complex or other kinds of defense contractors and some oil services companies. It's just difficult to disentangle these things. So I don't pretend to be able to do that perfectly. And perhaps the American hard right militarist side, it really is so strong and so crazy that they just want to pursue these policies based on their own craziness, and that they just sort of opportunistically take advantage of the alignment with ultra-Zionist interests. That's a possibility. But to me, it seems less likely because they are destroying the empire, and it doesn't seem that it's in ways that are quite predictable and have been predicted. So this doesn't, to me, this suggests that it may well be the hardline Zionists that have been propelling neoconservative ideology and policy as the guiding doctrine of the U.S. empire and the guiding grand strategy of the U.S. empire. And this era at the end of the Cold War, I think, is really worth looking at. And episodes like the Brewton book are to me fascinating and illuminating. And I hope that this was sort of a comprehensible dive into this, because I do think it's significant. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. Special thanks to Four Died Trying for supporting the Devil's Chess Club. Visit fourdiedtrying.com for details. And don't forget to subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for the best coverage of the deep politics of the U.S. empire. This includes our new series on the global drug metagroup, a milieu that appears to have staged the 1999 Moscow apartment bombings, which were blamed on Chechen jihadis. though some Americans attempted to call it a Russian false flag. The attacks are sometimes described as the Russian 9/11. I think there's a lot of reason to believe that the false flag was carried out by drug trafficking, anti-Russian, pro-Western forces. And there's much reason to suspect that some of these networks were also deeply involved in the American 9/11 a couple years later. Lastly, I want us all to hold David Talbot in the light, as it were. David gave up a successful career in mainstream left liberal journalism to tell the story of the Kennedy assassinations. It is really only because of David that we know how Bobby Kennedy planned to go after JFK's killers once he got to the White House. And he wrote the singularly fantastic book, Devil's Chessboard. My last conversation with him, during this conversation, he said, "I'll be moving for the next couple of weeks, but I'll be back after that co-hosting Devil's Chess Club regularly." It was his idea to do that last episode on the RFK assassination. He still wanted to do it in the midst of his move, but then I didn't hear from him, and I guess I know why now. I wish that I could do more for David, like I'm sure many of you do, but all I can do right now is to refer you to the GoFundMe campaign. The link is in the show notes. David, we miss you and are hoping so much that we'll be able to hear from you again in some way.